to build the assets of the future through the National Infrastructure Fund that we brought into force. Today, Kenya changes again how it will preserve its wealth and its future. Today, we enshrine in law the institution that will ensure that the prosperity of those assets we create endures for generations, and that is the National Sovereign Wealth Fund. Let me state the principle plainly, because everything I say after this flows from it. If the National Infrastructure Fund builds the assets that grow our nation, the Sovereign Wealth Fund preserves and multiplies the wealth the assets create. I know there was a question asked to the panelists. I must congratulate all the panelists who spoke here for their candor in explaining to us from their perspective, from the private sector perspective, what they see in what we are doing as government. And the question was, we have the National Infrastructure Fund, now we have the Sovereign Wealth Fund. What is the difference and what is the connection? In my very simple understanding, the National Infrastructure Fund builds our present. You know very well that we have many projects, critical infrastructure that we are desirous of building as a nation. But on the other hand, we have limited resources on how to deliver on these very critical infrastructure projects. The National Infrastructure Fund creates the bridge between the infrastructure projects that we need for our growth and the resources that will unlock the capital for us to implement these projects. I will give you an example. We've just signed the contract for the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. It's going to be a 150 billion shilling project. We cannot build that project using our budget because it's heavy. So we will not borrow and we will not add additional taxes. What's going to happen is that we're going to use 20 billion shillings of the money we raised under our National Infrastructure Fund to crowd in the balance of the money from the private sector. That is how innovation works in the transformation of a nation. That is why in our midst here, we have fund managers, we have different investors, we have banks who are looking at the opportunity, pension funds who are looking at the opportunity to invest in Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. That is what NIF is going to do. But Sovereign Wealth Fund will connect the investment we are making in Jomo Kenyatta to the future generations. Because apart from benefiting from resources that will come from our natural resources in oil and minerals, we will also be investing profits that come from investment in our very critical infrastructure like Jomo Kenyatta in the Sovereign Wealth Fund, so that Lynn here and Ronnie and the young ones that came to witness this signing can have a portion of the investments we are making today for their future. So this is the connection that we are making between the present and the future. These are not isolated milestones. They are successive chapters in the deliberate transformation of our republic. Over the past 3 years, the bottom-up economic transformation agenda has restored stability, rebuilt confidence, strengthened our economy, and laid the foundations for sustained inclusive growth. With those foundations in place, we now transform how Kenya finances development, mobilizing domestic savings and private capital to build the assets of the future. But financing development is only half the journey. Today, we ask a different question. What do we do with the wealth, the assets we are building today, and the natural resources we are unlocking today? What are we doing about the future? Do we use it all in our lifetime? Or do we preserve part of it so that future generations inherit not just what we found, but the prosperity we created with what we found? Our Constitution answers that question long before we do. Article 201C provides that, and I quote, "The burdens and benefits of the use of resources and of public borrowing shall be shared equitably between present and future generations." End of quote. This is far more than a principle of public finance. It is a constitutional covenant between generations. Today, through the Sovereign Wealth Fund, we give practical effect to that constitutional promise in front of our children. Natural resources are different from taxation or ordinary economic production. They are finite by their nature. Once a barrel of oil is extracted, it can never be extracted again. Once a mineral deposit has been exhausted, it is gone forever. If one generation consumes all the proceeds from exhaustible resources, it leaves nothing but empty mines and depleted oil fields for those who come after. That is neither prudent economics nor responsible stewardship. Around the world, history offers powerful lessons. Kuwait began the journey in 1953. But perhaps the best known example is Norway, as has been stated here, which I had the privilege of visiting a few weeks ago. And I sat across the table with a minister who was present 30 years ago when they started their Sovereign Wealth Fund. And I had a real eyeball-to-eyeball conversation because I knew that shortly I will be signing Kenya's Sovereign Wealth Fund. And just imagine what has happened in one generation. Norway has done something phenomenal. In one generation, in 30 years, they have built the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. $2 trillion. $2.2 trillion. 280 trillion Kenya shillings. I mean, in just 30 years. So when I tell our good citizens that we can be a first world country in 1 generation, it is possible. If anybody had any doubt in their mind what is achievable with focus, courage, and determination, look at what Norway has done. Rather than consume all the wealth generated from its North Sea oil, Norway chose to invest for the future. Today, as I have said, its sovereign wealth fund is worth $2.2 trillion. It owns about 1.5% of all listed companies in the world, with investments in more than 7,200 companies across the globe, including Equity Bank, right here at home, 14% in James' own words. That is how transformation works. That is the power of disciplined investing and long-term thinking. Closer home, Botswana, again as has been said here, built the Pula Fund. Pula means rain. In a dry land like Botswana, setting up a reserve is not an indulgence. It is a survival strategy. Rwanda has done the same. Many other countries have done so. Today, Kenya proudly joins that community of nations that saves while they build. The lesson from each of these nations is unmistakable. Natural resources create opportunity. Institutions determine destiny. Without the right institutions, even great natural wealth can become a missed opportunity. Economists call this the resource curse. I dare say they give it the wrong name. The curse is not the resources. The curse is the failure in stewardship. Kenya has learned this lesson through experience. For many years, Kenya extracted titanium from the mineral sands of Kwale. It was one of the largest mining investments in our country's history. The minerals were extracted. Those deposits can never be mined again. What answer shall we give one day to our children when they ask us what happened to titanium? That is why this legislation that today becomes law in Kenya is consequential. So that never again will we mine or use resources without a trace for the future generations. Kenya is expected, and you have heard from Paul Ruto, to commence oil production from the Lokichar Basin in Turkana. For decades, that discovery has represented hope. Today, it also represents responsibility. The question before us is not simply whether Kenya will produce oil. The question is whether Kenya will manage the proceeds wisely. Every barrel extracted should become an asset that never runs dry.